Rome did not die in Rome. Its last Western insignia reached Constantinople in a battered chest, and Zeno received not a victory, but a burden. In Italy, the Western court had ceased to rule on the Bosporus. Rome still had to turn grain into bread, gold into pay, and orders into obedience. Every morning, the weight returned. But what sort of Rome survives by leaving Rome behind? How did endurance become strength, then habit, then burden? By 453, the city still counted, sealed, and commanded. The question is not why the walls finally broke. It is what had already failed behind them.
In 476, Roman power became a riddle. After Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, an embassy from Rome sent the Western imperial insignia east to Zeno in Constantinople. In Italy, the Western imperial office had ended. In Constantinople, another emperor still received embassies, issued laws, and expected soldiers to obey. That is the problem at the center of Byzantium. Rome had fallen, and Rome was still governing. The old city on the Tiber no longer commanded an empire, yet a Roman capital stood on the Bosporus, counting taxes, receiving petitions, and claiming the lawful continuation of Roman rule. Roman life in the West did not vanish overnight. Senators still held estates. Bishops still governed communities. Successor kings often used Roman titles and Roman officials when it suited them. The sharper change was constitutional. There was no Western emperor sending orders across the provinces. The imperial command had moved into one surviving court. We call that world Byzantine. Its people did not. To them, the empire was Roman, even as Greek became the normal language of imperial administration and culture. The court, the laws, the coinage, and the public rituals all carried the Roman name. It was not a museum label. It was how governments still worked. Look at the map, and the survival begins to make sense. Constantinople stood where the Bosporus narrows between Europe and Asia. Northwards lay the Black Sea. Southwards, the Sea of Marmara opened towards the Aegean and the Mediterranean. Ships could be watched, taxed, supplied, or blocked. Armies moving between the Balkans and Anatolia had to reckon with water, walls, and distance. Before Constantine, the city had been Byzantine, a Greek settlement with a useful harbour and a hard promontory. Constantine remade it in the 4th century as an imperial capital. He gave it forums, palaces, churches, columns, and ceremonies. He also gave Rome a second centre of gravity, placed closer to the empire's richest eastern provinces. When Theodosius died in 395, rule was divided between eastern and western courts. The division was meant to manage scale, not to create two separate civilizations. Yet the eastern half had advantages the west increasingly lacked. Egypt and Syria remained major sources of revenue and grain. Anatolia offered manpower and strategic depth. Eastern cities were numerous, old, and tied into a dense administrative world. In the 5th century, that eastern density counted. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Thessalonica, and many smaller centers supported officials, bishops, merchants, craftsmen, and landowners who were used to imperial government. Tax collection was resented, as it always had been. It still worked often enough. Imperial coinage retained prestige. Soldiers could be paid more reliably than in many Western regions. The Eastern Empire was not peaceful. Court politics could be ruthless. Religious disputes could shake whole provinces. Frontier armies demanded money. Earthquakes damaged walls and aqueducts. Even so, the machinery kept moving. A farmer still saw the tax collector. A merchant still weighed coin. A clerk still wrote in the emperor's name. Constantinople made that power physical. The Theodosian walls ran across the landward side in deep stone layers. The Golden Horn gave ships shelter. The Hippodrome gathered crowds whose cheers could flatter or threaten an emperor. The Great Palace looked towards ceremonial spaces where soldiers, senators, bishops, envoys, and petitioners all understood the order of precedence. The city was never a marble still life. It was noisy, crowded, and practical. Carts moved through streets with grain and timber. Bakers worked before dawn. Sailors argued on the quays. Monks preached, shopkeepers bargained, and guards watched gates that needed constant repair. Behind the ceremony stood a working capital, and behind the capital stood fields, ports, courts, and ledgers. Then came the temptation to make the map whole again. In the 6th century, Justinian tried to recover the Western Mediterranean. His generals crossed to North Africa and defeated the Vandal kingdom. They fought in Italy against the Ostrogoths. Ravenna returned to imperial rule. Rome itself was taken, lost, and taken again during a war that left deep damage behind. Justinian's reign gave the empire one of its most durable achievements: the codification of Roman law. The Codex Justinianus and the wider legal project gathered centuries of imperial legislation into a form later generations could study and use. Armies might lose provinces. Buildings might fall. Law travelled more quietly, and sometimes much further. The same reign nearly broke in the capital. The Nika revolt turned anger in the Hippodrome into a crisis of government. Justinian survived, and Constantinople was rebuilt with a new statement of imperial Christianity at its centre. Hagia Sophia rose under the architects Anthemios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus. Its dome gathered light with an effect that still feels difficult to reduce to engineering. The building was worship, politics, and mathematics joined in stone. Marble panels climbed the walls. Gold surfaces caught shifting light. Processions moved beneath a dome that seemed to hover over the congregation. A visitor did not need a court official to explain the message. The emperor's world still possessed wealth, skill, and sacred confidence. Justinian's restoration strained the state that made it possible. Italy was difficult to hold after years of fighting. North Africa required defense. The Balkans faced pressure from peoples moving across and beyond the Danube. The frontier with Persia remained dangerous. Then plague struck the Mediterranean world, reducing populations and revenues at a moment when imperial ambition was already expensive. After Justinian, the empire looked large on parchment and tired in practice. Garrisons had to be supplied. Roads and forts had to be maintained. Recovered provinces did not automatically become secure provinces. The court in Constantinople could still command, but every command had a cost. By the early 7th century, those costs met a far greater shock. War with Sasanian Persia became a struggle for survival. Persian armies took Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Jerusalem fell to them. Alexandria was lost. These were not decorative provinces on the edge of the map. They were tax bases, grain lands, ancient cities, and sacred landscapes. Their loss cut into the empire's treasury and imagination at once. Heraclius fought back with remarkable endurance. His campaigns against Persia restored imperial honor and recovered what had been taken. For a brief moment, Constantinople could believe that the old pattern had returned. Crisis, counterstroke, victory. The victory came after exhaustion. The two great powers had weakened each other badly. Then the Arab conquest changed the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantine forces were defeated at Yarmouk, and Syria passed beyond imperial control. Egypt followed soon after. The empire lost lands that had fed its capital, funded its armies, and shaped its theology. The reduction was not temporary. Constantinople now ruled a smaller, harder, more Anatolian empire. The 7th century forced practical changes. Cities contracted. Some public spaces lost their old functions. Fortified settlements became more important. Provincial command changed as soldiers, local defense, taxation, and imperial authority were rearranged under pressure. Later sources describe themes, military administrative units that became central to Middle Byzantine defense. Their origins remain debated, and their land, pay, and service arrangements changed over time. The state now had to do with less. Egypt's grain and Syria's revenue no longer stood behind the treasury. Anatolia became the core. The court had to defend mountain routes, passes, forts, and roads with fewer resources. Raids, negotiations, prisoner exchanges, border warfare, and careful diplomacy became part of ordinary government. For ordinary people, survival was not an idea. It arrived as orders. A village might rebuild after a raid, then receive a tax demand because the army still needed grain and animals. A mason might repair a wall damaged by weather before the next campaign season. A monastery might preserve an icon, a document, or a field boundary through years when imperial policy and local devotion did not always agree. Constantinople survived because the center held. Arab attacks failed to take the city, and the Great Siege of 717 to 718 confirmed how difficult Constantinople was to break. The walls mattered, but walls alone do not defend a capital. Ships, stores, crews, engineers, command, and morale all mattered. So did the city's position, with sea routes that could sustain it when armies pressed from land. Those failures left a hard lesson. Constantinople was not invulnerable, but it was extraordinarily difficult to take. For an empire that had lost so much, that fact was decisive. The capital bought time. Time allowed institutions to adapt. Time allowed children to grow into soldiers, fields to be replanted, and treaties to be made after campaigns had failed. Inside the empire, another struggle unfolded over sacred images. Iconoclasm divided imperial authority from powerful habits of devotion. Emperors, bishops, monks, soldiers, and ordinary worshippers argued over whether icons should be venerated or removed. The dispute wasn't uniform everywhere, and the surviving evidence is often shaped by later victory. Still, the controversy exposed a raw question. Who governed the sacred life of a Roman Christian state? When the veneration of icons was restored in the 9th century, the change was seen in wood, pigment, gold, and procession. Images returned to churches. Monasteries regained a language of devotion that imperial policy had tried to control. A restored icon was more than an object placed on a wall. It marked the return of confidence after a long argument over authority. By the 9th and 10th centuries, survival turned into movement. The so-called Macedonian period brought stronger government, military recovery, and renewed confidence in learning and art. Fields were cultivated more securely. Towns revived in places. Gold coinage still carried respect. Soldiers pushed eastwards across frontier zones, while imperial authority expanded again in the Balkans. The recovery also reached into books and offices. Legal texts were revised and reorganized. Court ceremony was studied, recorded, and performed with renewed care. Manuscripts preserved scripture, classical learning, theology, medicine, and grammar. This was not culture floating above politics. It was how a Roman state, now Greek-speaking in daily practice, explained itself to itself. This recovery had human texture. A village in Anatolia might send men to serve, grain to market, and taxes towards the capital. A monk might copy a manuscript in a hand shaped by older scholarship. A craftsman might set glass tesserae into a church wall. On the quays of Constantinople, a visitor might hear the voices of envoys, traders, and sailors from Armenian, Slavic, Arabic, Latin, and Greek-speaking worlds. The empire also projected influence without armies. Cyril and Methodius were sent to Great Moravia in the 9th century, and their mission became part of a much wider Slavic Christian tradition. Translation, alphabet, worship, and diplomacy carried power in quieter forms. Constantinople could shape distant societies through liturgy and letters, as well as through treaties. The military recovery became visible in campaigns led by men such as Nikephoros Phocas, who took Crete before becoming emperor, and by John Tzimiskes after him. Antioch returned to imperial hands. These were not symbolic victories only. They secured routes, ports, prestige, and the confidence of a state that had once fought mainly to endure. By the age of Basil II, the empire had reached a formidable high point. His long reign strengthened Byzantine authority in the Balkans after the defeat of Bulgaria. The eastern frontiers were also more secure than they had been for generations. Constantinople again looked out from the center of a serious military state, not a relic protected by walls. The splendor of that age was disciplined, not idle. The court staged receptions with deliberate precision. Hagia Sophia remained the city's sacred center. The palace controlled access to the emperor with rituals that impressed foreign envoys. Markets served residents and strangers alike. The empire's wealth was real, though unevenly shared and constantly drawn upon by war. Weakness grew in the same soil. Great landholding families increased their power. Small farmers, important for taxation and military service, came under pressure. After Basil, succession became less steady. Court factions and military aristocrats competed for influence. The treasury still had resources, while the recruiting base and provincial authority began to fray. The 11th century brought enemies on several fronts. Norman forces advanced in southern Italy and later threatened the Balkans. Italian maritime cities demanded privileges that weakened Byzantine control over trade. In the east, Seljuk Turkish power moved into the lands beyond the imperial frontier, then into Anatolia itself. These challenges converged before the empire had recovered its old steadiness. Manzikert, in 1071, became the name attached to the breaking point. The battle was a serious defeat, and the emperor, Romanos IV, was captured. Yet Asia Minor was not lost in a single afternoon. The catastrophe came through the civil conflict and political fragmentation that followed. Imperial authority failed to reassert itself quickly enough, and Turkish settlement and rule spread across much of Anatolia. The loss struck the empire's core. Anatolia had supplied taxes, soldiers, food, roads, and strategic depth. Without secure control there, Constantinople became more exposed and more dependent on bargains. Mercenaries, Western knights, local rulers, and foreign fleets could help in a crisis. They also brought their own interest into Byzantine politics. Alexios I Komnenos pulled the state back from danger at the end of the 11th century. His rule was practical and often improvisational. He fought Normans, managed rivals, and sought Western help against Turkish pressure. To secure naval support, he granted commercial privileges to Venice. The decision answered an immediate need, but it gave Italian merchants a stronger place in the empire's economic life. The Crusades transformed that problem. Alexios had wanted military assistance. What arrived was a vast movement of armed pilgrims, nobles, followers, and ambitions. The First Crusade helped restore some Byzantine positions in Western Anatolia, but suspicion ran both ways. Constantinople saw useful warriors and dangerous guests. Many Westerners saw Byzantine diplomacy as evasive or untrustworthy. The Komnenian emperors rebuilt enough strength to keep the empire impressive through much of the 12th century. Armies campaigned again. Diplomacy stretched from Hungary to the Crusader states. Manuel I presented himself as a ruler of wide ambitions. This recovery depended heavily on capable emperors, expensive alliances, and personal authority. It did not fully repair the deeper losses in Anatolia. After Manuel's death, the political balance worsened. A child emperor, regency, politics, court violence, and aristocratic rivalry weakened the center. Resentment against privileged Latin merchants in Constantinople turned into severe violence in 1182, deepening hostility between Byzantines and Westerners. The empire still had ceremony and walls, but it was losing the ability to manage the forces gathering around it. On the water, another change had already gathered force. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan merchants gained footholds, concessions, and privileges. Their ships carried goods that Constantinople wanted, but their growing power reduced what the imperial treasury could draw from trade. Much of the most profitable maritime commerce shifted into Italian hands, even as it passed around the Byzantine capital. The break came in 1204. The Fourth Crusade had been preached for war against Muslim power in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Egypt as the intended route towards Jerusalem. Debt, Venetian interests, dynastic politics, an opportunity drew it instead to Constantinople. The city that had survived Persians, Arabs, Rus, and Bulgars was taken by Latin Christian forces. The damage was severe. Churches, palaces, relics, and treasuries were stripped or disrupted. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople. Byzantine power survived in exile, especially at Nicaea, while other Greek successor states appeared in Epirus and Trebizond. The Roman claim continued, but the capital's aura had been broken. For enemies and allies alike, the city had become imaginable as a prize. In 1261, the emperors of Nicaea recovered Constantinople. The return carried real emotional force. The palace rituals resumed. Hagia Sophia again belonged to the restored empire. Officials copied documents in the old capital, but the city they entered was poorer, thinner, and scarred by occupation. The restored empire possessed the name and the ceremonies. It lacked the old territorial base. Paleologan centuries were not empty decline. They produced remarkable art, theology, and scholarship. The Kora monastery preserves the refinement of late Byzantine visual culture, with mosaics and frescoes shaped by learning and devotion. Scholars studied ancient Greek texts, copied manuscripts, and argued over philosophy and doctrine. A weakened empire could still think with precision. Political life was less graceful. Civil wars in the 14th century drained money and trust. Rival claimants drew in Serbian, Bulgarian, Ottoman, and other forces. The Black Death worsened disruption across the region. Genoese and Venetian colonies controlled important commercial spaces. The empire's remaining territories became fragmented, vulnerable, and often dependent on arrangements made under pressure. Ottoman power rose first in northwestern Anatolia, then crossed into Europe. Its advance was not one sudden encirclement. It was a long tightening of the ground around Constantinople. Towns, roads, fields, and fortresses passed increasingly under Ottoman authority. The Roman emperor still ruled from the city, but beyond the walls, another power controlled much of the landscape that kept a capital alive. By the 15th century, Constantinople was still magnificent from a distance. The Theodosian walls ran across the landward side in massive lines. Hagia Sophia still lifted its dome over the city, yet the space inside the walls had thinned. Gardens, ruins, and open ground occupied areas that had once held crowded neighborhoods. The city remained imperial, but it was too large for the state it housed. In 1453, Mehmed II brought more than artillery. He brought a siege system. Heavy guns battered the walls, while blockade, manpower, engineering, naval pressure, and repeated assaults wore down the defense. The defenders repaired breaches at night and guarded a circuit too wide for their numbers. They fought with discipline, but their margin for failure had almost disappeared. The last emperor, Constantine XI, ruled a city with a treasury far weaker than its title. Greeks, Genoese, Venetians, and others joined the defense. Old church divisions still mattered, but the immediate facts were blunt. There were too few defenders, too little money, and no relief strong enough to force Mehmed away. When the city fell on the 29th of May, 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire ended as a political state. The conquest brought severe violence, as sieges often did, but the city was not erased. Mehmed remade it as an Ottoman imperial capital. Ottoman documents long used forms such as Constantinia, while Istanbul also circulated before becoming the modern official name. Ottoman rule changed the city profoundly. Hagia Sophia became a mosque. New palaces, markets, mosques, schools, and neighborhoods reshaped public life. Older structures remained beneath the new capital's movement. Cisterns, aqueducts, columns, walls, and street lines. Constantinople did not survive as Byzantium. It survived as a city repeatedly rebuilt by power. The clearest afterlife of Byzantium was not a territory. It was a set of portable inheritances. An icon could hang in a church far from the Bosporus. A manuscript could be copied in one city and read in another. A legal text could outlive the court that ordered its compilation. A seal could remain after the office behind it had disappeared. Orthodox liturgy carried the cadence of Constantinople into the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Icons, mosaics, church plans, chant, monastic habits, and theological language all bore the mark of the empire. In many places, the emperor disappeared from politics while Byzantine forms of worship and sacred art remained familiar. Books carried another inheritance. Byzantine scholars preserved and studied Greek texts in philosophy, medicine, mathematics, grammar, and theology. Some manuscripts moved west through trade, diplomacy, collecting, and the travels of scholars before and after the fall. Renaissance Italy did not receive classical learning from one source alone, but Byzantine Greek scholarship formed an important part of that wider recovery. Law also outlived the state. Justinian's legal compilation remained a foundation for later study in parts of Europe. Its influence was uneven, revived in different places at different times, and adapted for worlds Justinian never imagined. A 6th century emperor's legal project continued to speak after the empire that sponsored it had vanished. The Roman name had a political afterlife too. In Moscow, churchmen and rulers later developed claims connected to Byzantine and Roman inheritance. The idea of a third Rome did not make Russia a simple continuation of Constantinople. It shows that the Roman title still carried authority. Even in absence, Byzantium offered a language of legitimacy that others wanted to possess. The empire's achievement was not sameness. It changed repeatedly. Its armies were reorganized. Its borders shrank, recovered, and shrank again. Its religious disputes reshaped art and public life. Its capital was damaged, restored, and finally conquered. Through all of this, people kept calling themselves Romans. That claim rested on daily practice. Taxes were assessed. Coins were struck. Petitions were copied. Walls were repaired. Priests prayed for the emperor. Soldiers took orders from men who still used Roman titles. A state becomes real through such acts. It disappears when too many of them can no longer be carried out. By 1453, much of the practical structure had gone. Land had been lost. Revenue had narrowed. The army had withered. The most profitable maritime trade had shifted towards Venetian and Genoese hands. Allies were uncertain. The capital could still count, seal, and command, but fewer roads, ports, and fields answered back. Rome didn't end in one fall. In the West, the imperial office disappeared in the 5th century, while Roman habits survived under new rulers. In the East, the imperial state lived on the Bosporus for nearly 1,000 more years. It was brilliant, anxious, resilient, and often exhausted. After the conquest, the walls still stood. Coins and seals remained in treasuries, collections, and soil. Greek manuscripts survived in libraries and in the hands of scholars. The liturgy continued in churches far from the Bosporus. The court was gone. But a page could still be opened, a coin still turned in the hand, and a chant still carried the shape of an empire that had outlived Rome itself.